Now, Jesus arrives in the land of Gennesaret. And as he does, he's recognized as the preacher, the teacher, the miracle worker from Galilee. And word goes out. And as the word goes out, people come. First by singles, then by tens, then by dozens, then by hundreds. They come. This man who has healed the blind, this man who has cured the lame, this man who has such words of hope, contains such wisdom, that they touch hearts and minds and souls in profound ways. He has come. And because he has come by the hundreds, people come so that their lives can be touched by God. And then it begins. Jesus begins to heal and bless and pray. And then he begins to preach. Calling the crowd to him, he says, "Listen and understand. What goes into someone's mouth does not defile them, but what comes out of their mouth, that is what defiles them." Stunned silence shocks the crowd. After a moment, a group of men push their way through, the crowd grumbling, and they leave. With this panicky-looking, disciples run to Jesus and they say, "Did you know how upset the Pharisees were when they heard what you said?" "Why were they upset with what I said?" "My Lord, you said, what goes into someone's mouth doesn't defile them, but it is written, every animal that does not have divided hoof, or that does not chew the cud, is unclean for you. Do not eat them. Whoever touches the carcass of any of them, they will be unclean. That is what is written." This is what they preach, and that is what we Jews live by. Peter, Jesus says, the Pharisees are devout. They're pious believers. But in this, they are wrong. They are blind men leading the blind. When a blind man leads a blind man, they both end up in the ditch. Peter said, "I don't understand, Lord. Aren't they following the will of God?" And Jesus replies, "Peter, do you really think that God cares what kind of food you put in your mouth? Whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach, then out of the body again. But the things that come out of a person's mouth comes from their heart. And these things that hurt the heart, and these things are the things that hurt the heart of God. For out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. Not whether they ate pork or lamb or veal." And my friends, that is the question of the day back then, and is the question of our lives here today. What is important to God? This is the question because what is important to God is something that perhaps we should make important in our lives as well. The scribes and the Pharisees, they were devout and pious believers, and they lived very disciplined lifestyles. But they were wrong. But where they were wrong is that they thought that what was important to God was observing rules and regulations, which had to do with cleanliness and uncleanliness, with what a person ate, with whom a person associated with, and what a person touched. They couldn't eat pork or rabbit, or God would turn his back on them. They couldn't associate with women when she was menstruating, or associate with a Jew, or God would turn his back on them. They couldn't touch a dead body, whether it be a human or their dog, or God would turn their back on them. So the Pharisees spent their entire lives trying to avoid situations and people that might make them unclean. But here Jesus says, no. If you think that these things are important to God, then you are like blind men, because you obviously can't see what is truly important. And if someone follows your example, then they are like blind men too. And instead of bringing your people closer to God. They're going to take you to a place of ruin, because living this kind of lifestyle will actually prevent you from doing the things that are important in the eyes of God. So I guess this begs the question, what is important to God? And how can we make this important in our lives as well? Well, let's continue on with the story. Jesus leaves Galilee, goes up to the area of Tyre and Sidon. And as he does, he's recognized as the preacher, the teacher, the miracle worker from Galilee. And again, the word spreads, but this time it's different. No one comes. You see, in Tyre and Sidon, Jews are tolerated at best, hated at worst. Now, neither Jesus nor his God are welcomed here. So no one comes. Well, almost no one comes. No one comes but a Canaanite woman whose people hate the Jews the most. As she approaches, the disciples expect her to hurl insults or even stones. But she doesn't. Instead, she cries out, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. A demon controls my daughter, and she's suffering terribly." Now, had this happened in Galilee, had she not been recognized as a Canaanite woman, she would have been brought to Jesus, no questions asked. But this time it's different. They're in the region of Tyre and Sidon, where they're tolerated at best, hated at worst. It's different this time because she's a Canaanite woman. She's a non-Jew. And to touch her and to associate with her would make them unclean, just like the Pharisees said. Not only that, but there's something radically wrong with her daughter, and to associate with her daughter would make them unclean. So instead of bringing her to Jesus, the disciples beg him, "Send her away. She keeps crying out after us. We don't want this kind of woman around us." What goes into someone's mouth doesn't defile them, but what comes out of their mouth is what defiles them. What do you think is defiling right now? What do you think is in the heart of those disciples? Is it something that's important to God? Let's continue on. The woman falls on her knees in front of Jesus and says, "Lord, help me. My daughter is suffering. Help me. Help my daughter." Now, the Pharisees would have sent her away and would have thought that God would smile on their actions. But Jesus does something different. He doesn't say, "Get lost or go away." Jesus answers, "Woman, you have great faith. You will be given what you ask for." And her daughter was healed that very moment. What goes into someone's mouth doesn't defile them. But what comes out of their mouth, that is what defiles them. What came out of her mouth? A plea to God. A request for help. What's important to God that we should make important to our lives? The first thing is love for others. This woman came to Jesus not asking for anything for herself. She came for her daughter who was suffering terribly. It was this love that made her approach this Jewish healer, despite the objections of her husband, despite the objections of her friends, despite the objections of her family members. And I can say that because Remember what the passage says. She came alone. It wasn't her husband that came, the leader of the household. She didn't come with any of her brothers. Didn't come with any of her friends. A woman traveling alone. That's how desperate she was. It was love that made her accept his silence and yet still ask for help. It was love that allowed her to suffer the disciples' harsh treatment, yet continue on. It was love that enabled her to see the compassion behind Jesus' words. The driving force in this woman's heart was love. And there's nothing stronger and nothing nearer to God than that very thing. We all sang it together. Love lifted me. What's the other thing? Love is important to God. Love of others. The other thing is faith in God. Faith in God changes how we see this world and how we act in this world. It is faith that draws us to God, that brings us closer to God. And as we get closer to God, we are changed on a very fundamental level. When we first encountered this woman, she was following Jesus. She was following him. When we last saw this woman, she was on her knees. When we first heard this woman speak, she called out with a request. When we last heard her speak, she ended with a prayer. A person is made right through God and through his faith. Romans 3:28. If love of others and faith are the most important things to God, how can we make these things the most important things in our lives? I suppose we see it right here. Spending time with Jesus. This woman spent a small amount of time with Jesus, and she was transformed by it. The disciples who witnessed Jesus in action with this woman had their attitudes, their minds, their hearts transformed. And by spending time with Jesus, we too can be transformed. And I wish those people in the States who showed up in Charlottesville, both on the left and on the right, had spent a little bit more time with Jesus. How can we spend time with him? How can we spend time with Jesus by coming? We can spend time with Jesus by coming to worship on a Sunday, by spending time with him in prayer, by spending time reading our Bibles, and when we do, we will hear his words. We will hear things like, love God with all your mind, heart, strength, and soul, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Did that happen down in the States? You'll hear him say things like, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. That happened down in the States? You will hear things like, if anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need, but has no pity on them, how can the love of God be in that person? Dear children, let us not love with words or speech, but with actions and in truth. And as these verses imply, we can spend time with Jesus by doing his work. What's God's work? Well, the welfare of his children. Not just the ones from our own social circles, not just the ones who come to our church, not just the ones that we like, but all his children. It's by spending time with Jesus in worship, in prayer, in study, and in doing his work that we're making love of others and faith in God the most important things in our lives. It's by spending time with Jesus in worship and prayer and study and doing his work that we start building a relation between ourselves and God and ourselves and that other person. And this is what God wants from us. And this is what God wants for us. In our Bible story today, we heard him tell Peter that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach. Whatever comes out of the body again, and then goes out of the body again. But the things that come out of a person's mouth comes from the heart. And these are the things that can hurt the heart of God. And I ask you, after hearing that sermon, and then seeing that Canaanite woman, did they understand what he tried to preach to them back then? Turn her away. She's following and crying out after us. She's a Canaanite woman. They don't like us. Turn her away. That came from a place in their heart. And it hurt the heart of God. But the woman from the clan that hated the Jews cried out to him, Lord, Son of David, heal my daughter. That came from a place of love. Maybe love and desperation, but it came from a point in love. God heard. And God responded. In our Bible story today, we heard Peter tell these things. And in the Beatitudes, it says, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And what I can tell you today is that when we make the love in our heart and our faith in God the most important things in our lives, we shall be able to see God acting and working in this world. And my friends, the world will be able to see God acting and working in us. To which I can only say, thanks be to God, and amen.